Soviet Union was like a public bus. Half people were standing and holding up to the pipe, and half were sitting in jail. That's what the joke was. My parents were kids, but they remember when neighbors were disappearing. So how do you change that? You cannot change the fear. My name is Boris Hoffman. I was born in Lithuania and came to the United States in 1986. My opinion is the whole system of that beliefs, the socialism, is based upon you're not a person anymore. You become a bolt and a nut in a mechanism of a big machine. It was no equality in Soviet Union because people who were in charge were in charge. And you were just that person who was allowed to work, and they would pay you some money, and because everything was taken over, means of production, they belonged to government. They did what they wanted to do. For example, we have a copy of a confiscation. They forced you to sign paperwork. My late father-in-law, his family owned a lot of land, and we were farmers. He started plowing the fields at 9. They came in, the barn was full of cattle. It was a beautiful house, probably a few thousand acres left, what we had there, and they told them, you have to sign a paper, you give everything up, and we have a copy of a list what they gave up. And they signed off, and they were going to take him to Siberia. I guess labor camp wasn't good enough. But because my mother-in-law happened to be of Russian descent, she spoke Russian, and they gave him some moonshine because the NKVD people were hungry, and what do? It's cold. So they fed them, gave them alcohol, and they told them, get the heck out, we'll grab somebody else. From the stories of my father-in-law, and they put them in that cattle wagons and took them to Siberia. I remember he was telling me that about 6,000 people were brought to the city called Medvezhegorsk on the Finnish border. So they brought about 6,000 people. He was there for 17 months. At the end of his time, original people who came with him, about 350 survived. The first thing what they did here, I remember he was telling me that they told them to take a shower, to clean themselves up, and they burned their clothes. So they told them, here is some cardboards and plywood pieces, you can put something on yourself to survive. And after a while they gave him the clothing, and they worked him for 12 hours a day, and the food was very bad. I had a coworker, he was 15 when his family was sent out abroad to Siberia, and he would cry, he'd get drunk. That's how affected him, and he would cry. He opened up and he was telling horrible stories of torture and deprivation, just unbelievable stuff. I met a woman who knew her parents because her husband was with them in the forest, and at 13 or 14 she went up above polar circle on the island in the Northern Sea. And the story was simple. We had like about 100 people, and they gave him nets and axes, said good luck, and little firewood, good luck surviving. So almost everybody died, but she was very strong and she survived. So there is no end to that horrible stories. They didn't care who you are, Jew, Russian, Lithuanian, Polish. Human life didn't have any much of a worth in Soviet Union. But I know of people who would speak up, and they would actually arrest you for jaywalking if you were in opposition to a government, and you would disappear, and they would take you to that KGB prison in capital, actually that beautiful old building, and they would beat the heck out of you. And my wife was telling me the story, one of the relatives of her dad's pretended to be mute when they arrested him, so he pretended not to speak and nothing on purpose. And when he came out, he was normal again, because, it was a horrible thing. We had a class of rulers and class of kind of slaves, actually, because, they controlled your life from the day one to your death. My mom and dad didn't join the Communist Party. They offered many times. They didn't want to do it because they didn't believe in that thing. And my dad was a manager of a fairly big construction company for a while. But because he wasn't playing with wolves, so to speak, he wasn't making any money and not bribing anybody, and he refused to join Communist Party. It's interesting, they honored him at his 50th birthday. The company had a banquet and everything was great. Everybody loved him, and 2 years later they fired him because he had a new boss and the guy was a crook. So, and I was telling my parents since I was like in the end of high school that we have to go because there is nothing for us here. Because they had certain ethnical groups they despised. And I remember sometimes I would say very offensive, oh, you Jews are like a bourgeois. We're teachers in school. Because it depended what the political climate was in the country. You know, we had articles about Jews, and they wrote articles about Zionists, exploiting and abusing Arabs. I mean, you don't know when you're a kid what we're talking about, but that reflected to the public. People who needed to express their anger at somebody, they would talk about Jews, Jews that, Jews this. I remember all my life there in a public transportation because we didn't have a car. So they would call you dirty Jew, go to Israel. And when you're a kid, you think, why would you tell you that? I grew up here too. Well, they knew I'm a Jew because you look like a Jew, you know. I didn't have a big nose that time, and actually I was blonde till I was 12. So it wasn't so bad, but when they see your last name, they know. You're not German, you look like a German guy. So, and they would make fun. Sometimes kids, well, I had a lot of fights with kids because they'd call me dirty Jew and I didn't like it, so I would fight back. I wanted to be on my own. I never liked that social marching. I remember since I was second grade when they used to take us in elementary school and show us movies documentaries about Lenin. And I remember like it was yesterday. First year I had to go because I didn't know what they do. So they took us there and I asked them, what are we going to do? Oh, we're going to watch that movie about Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. So what do? I went in, as soon as they turned off the lights, I sneaked out. I was blessed with good head, so I liked chemistry and math and literature and physics. So I kind of wanted to be a medical doctor, but we had 2% quota for Jews. I was told that maybe you shouldn't try because the problem was if you miss that opportunity to go to school, you are drafted. So I decided I'm not going to take a chance. I liked construction anyways, and I liked math. When I graduated from engineering school in 1978, and I joined that group, it was a Construction Technology Design Institute. So they said, well, if you want to grow, you have to join the Communist Party. I said, you know what? It was about time I was going to apply. I said, I'll tell you a little later. So what I did, then they start pushing. I brought the invitation from Israel to immigrate, and they left me alone. So that's the life, It was the bad circumstances. There's nothing what you can do. Only one thing for people who have a mind on their own was to get out. So I used to walk to that immigration department of Communist Party of Lithuania, and they were talking nonsense. I was saying, well, you couldn't go because America doesn't want you to go. And I was asking, what America? I'm going to Israel, officially. So 1985, we applied the last time. I convinced my parents, and my dad was afraid to death too. But after he was fired, he realized it's time to go. So we had to sell our furniture, everything. And they allowed us to take a few luggages. And they were very gracious to us. They charged us 200 rubles for losing our citizenship in Russia. And we took a train from Vilnius toward Chop, which is like a border city with Hungary. And from Hungary we went to Austria. And after that we came to Italy, I think it was probably end of October, and we left Italy on January 9th, 1986. And they brought us through. We stopped shortly in New York from Rome and came to California because my brother was in California. And that was it. Well, I knew it's going to collapse because it's obvious. I don't want to sound like I know everything, but I wish we can meet people who I talk to, who I worked with, and I told them it's going to fall apart. Because why? Because look, we had a saying, people are pretending to work and government pretending to pay. It was no interest to do anything. Why? You know, that's what collapsed, because it's like the light in the end of a tunnel was fake and everybody knew. And it had to collapse because there was nothing going on. You had no freedom. You couldn't make enough money. Soviet Union was like a public bus. Half people were standing and holding up to the pipe and half were sitting in jail. That's what the joke was. My parents were kids, but they remember when neighbors were disappearing. So how do you change that? You cannot change the fear. But in Russia, they never had a good life. They never had a pride. People who had pride to own their own little farms, they exiled, killed, and destroyed. I couldn't stand that thing. I couldn't stand that life.